Just as a framing for this conversation, we did meet prior to this session to discuss how we're going to frame this. The word storage, as we are all aware, is quite broad. There's many different technologies that can fall into that. And I think for our session, we thought it would be helpful to frame it in the context of just battery storage. And there's a few reasons behind that. The first is that obviously batteries are going to play a very vital role, as Mike's just laid out, in achieving our 2040 goals. The second is that batteries, as we know on the basis of this conference, can play in short but also long duration strategies. And also the brevity of this session doesn't mean that we can deep dive into every single technology out there. So on that basis, we're just going to pursue with the idea that we're just going to think about batteries where possible. And I'm going to start my first question being, let's think about the need. So in order to unpack this, Paul, David, and Florent, I'm going to ask you guys, from the perspective of TNOs, what are the actual balancing and flexibility needs that we need to address in the next 15 years, and how can BESS actually contribute to that? So Paul, you're on my left, maybe I'll go for you first.
Yeah, no, thank you, and good morning, really pleased to be here. I think my colleague Mike has summed it up really well, and again, the previous speaker, batteries and storage have a critical role to play in helping us to operate a clean power energy system in all timescales, from real-time operation and all the fantastic services that batteries can provide to us in the control room to ensure that the lights stay on and we have all those response and reserve products that we need, through that shorter duration storage that is just now part of our daily life on the energy system, moving power from earlier in the day to later in the day, moving then into those longer periods of storage, and then into that very long duration storage. And as we've seen batteries come onto the system in greater numbers, seen the cost of that technology come down, I know you're talking about that over these couple of days, the benefit that they can bring in helping us fill in those grey blobs on Mike's diagram, which by 2030, we need to use unabated gas to fill in that gap. Well, we need to have something that gets rid of that unabated gas in all of those timescales. We're doing well, we think, by 2030 in the shorter timescales. It's those medium and longer term timescales that are really key going forwards, and a role for batteries and other technologies in helping us with those going forwards.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Paul. Florent, you're the next up. Maybe you want to talk about it from an RTE perspective.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So before going on the need, just RTE has a role in France to enlighten public authorities. So that's the first thing. It's one of our mission. And in order to reach the decarbonization goal, the Green Deal target, RTE and France is able to reach this goal if we activate 4 levers: nuclear energies, renewable energies, energy saving, and energy efficiency via buildings and other things. But it's not sufficient. In order to ensure security of supply, we need flexibilities. And that's the buzzword. What everybody uses now, flexibility, flexibility. But what kind of flexibility do we need now? There is, in my point of view, there are 3 kinds of flexibility. Flexibility for security of supply. Flexibility for stochastic variations of dynamic stability. And flexibility for network congestion. And the question of flexibility of security of supply is, I feel, is the main one for the moment. In 2030, in France, we need more than 5 gigawatts of flexibilities. We expect the participation of consumers with moving of loads, so by electric vehicle, or we can expect industrial participation. But if consumers don't participate and don't move their loads from 7 p.m., where in France today, where the most important load, to noon, where we will have the massive generation of solar panel, we need other solutions. And batteries, or storage capabilities in general, could be a solution. There is an economical place for batteries.
Brilliant, thank you. That was super interesting from a French perspective. David, I want to hand over to you from an Irish perspective. We were talking the other day about all the amazing strategy work that you're doing. We'd love to hear about that.
Thanks, Phoebe. Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. Yeah, so look, I agree with everything that's been said in terms of, you know, the NESO perspective that Paul and Mike spoke about already, and on Florent. I suppose from an Irish perspective, we see ourselves as being slightly unique in the fact that we're somewhat more isolated from a grid perspective. And one of the things that we're very aware of right now is dispatch down on a heavily, you know, renewables-based system with predominantly wind and solar. What role does storage play in that? And like NESO, we have an equivalent kind of scenario planning framework called Tomorrow's Energy Scenarios. So that's published on our website and all the data is on there. They're all the assumptions that underpin all our analysis that we're doing today. And we're heavily focused on developing a net zero plan, a network fit for net zero. And as part of that, right in the middle of that, is storage. So to what extent can storage support the system? So we look at it in terms of, you know, grid stability, and the Dunkelflaute was discussed. So how do we fill that intermittency gap? So LDES we see as being, you know, critical for that. But it all boils down to location, and the impact that storage will bring will be location on the network. So is it going to be in constraint areas, or is it going to be unconstrained? And later this next month, we're going out to consultation on a procurement framework in support of our government and regulator on what the procurement principles will be around, you know, we're looking at 500 megawatts of LDES to be deployed, you know, in the late 20s, so just for delivery of 2030. So there's a lot going on, and from a planning perspective, which is the perspective I bring from the TSO, it's an integral part of how we think about the system overall.
So that long duration storage really coming to the fore now and being a really big question in the Irish case?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, just particularly in terms of how do we bridge that, you know, intermittency gap, you know, with a high res system.
And you spoke on the call that we had this week about 50 plus hours being a really key area to focus on.
Yeah, again, we've got 4 scenarios, I guess, in our Tomorrow's Energy Scenarios, and one is self-sustaining, which is kind of more of a domestic focus if you look at a full electrification of the economy. And as part of that, we would consider, if you assume we've got less interconnection, you know, less connection to kind of mainland Europe, you know, how would we be more self-sufficient and reliant? And LDES as being a big kind of part of that, coupled with, you know, obviously a balanced portfolio of generation as well, and looking at our thermal plant. We don't have the privilege of having nuclear on our system. It's a fossil-backed kind of system as well, so with our renewables. So looking at all of those, but LDES being a big part of it.
Brilliant. And so now, I guess we understand the need, we understand what is required, but what would be really interesting to understand is what batteries can actually do to support that need. Andy, I want to jump to you first. Given all the things that we've just heard about what the need is for 2040, I'd love to hear from you what role you think BESS can play, and particularly based off of our conversation, you know, is there a broader role that could be played? Florent's mentioned maybe batteries solving congestion issues. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, thank you, Phoebe, and good morning, everyone. Andy Willis, so I'm the CEO at Kona Energy. We're a developer of battery energy storage in the UK and the US, focused on transmission-connected batteries. So to link to both Florent's and David's points, I think at the minute we are very much focused on developing batteries in areas which can solve those congestion constraints. So in the UK, it is looking for areas where there are particularly thermal constraint needs and where a lot of renewable energy generation is getting curtailed, which batteries can help solve these issues through absorbing excess energy when there's too much of it, and in very simple terms, giving it back to the grid when it's needed. So that's the kind of very simple kind of logic for putting batteries in a constrained area. So if we take the kind of Scotland-England border, the B6 boundary, everyone's familiar that that is the most constrained part of the grid. So from a locational standpoint and a development perspective, there is an incentive to locate your asset there to solve some of those constraints. Are batteries being remunerated for having their asset there? At the moment, not really, because of kind of inefficiencies in the balancing mechanism and IT issues, but we do expect them to go forward. So there is, at the minute, a kind of locational need for these batteries, but the kind of value isn't being fully realized. But taking it a step beyond just kind of solving those particular thermal constraints, we at Kona think batteries can also be used for to actually act like transmission assets and kind of virtual transmission lines, and allowing the system operators and the TOs to actually push through more megawatt hours through the system at peak times by having batteries at key locations to manage constraints kind of pre or post fault. And I think that's a current area which is probably underutilized across the whole of Europe, but actually is another very big use case which can reduce constraint costs and solve major kind of stability and thermal issues for the system operators as well.
Super interesting, and because market design has been such a big theme here, and Elena was pointing to our work at the ETC on this at the moment. From your perspective, as an aside, we understand the need of TSOs, but from your perspective, to make batteries thrive better in that congestion case, what do you think needs to happen in order for them to be remunerated properly?
I mean, improvements in the balancing mechanism have been talked about a lot, and I think everyone's familiar with the issues and the improvements being made there. From that kind of batteries as a potential transmission product, we do think there should be a market product for that service. Kona have been engaged with a few other UK developers in NESO's Constraints Collaboration Project, which is a very positive initiative about using batteries in the short to medium term to help manage those constraints, basically before big transmission infrastructure is built in the early to mid 2030s. So there is a potential product that's kind of evolving there. Through that, I guess it would be a market. But at the moment, NESO have some concerns over coherency with other markets, mainly stability in managing voltage as well, which is kind of delaying a potential rollout of that product. But we think it should be a market solution, and it should ultimately be NESO tendering for that service.
Super interesting. Thank you so much. Jim, I want to jump to you to give your thoughts on this side of things as well.
I suppose the way I would approach this is to think about two key issues for what the system, the grid, will look like in 2040. I think one is an element of massive constraint complexity and how batteries can solve that. And the second is the issue around the volume, terawatt hour, duration need of the system at that point. I think on the first, I feel for the TOs. I think the green grid of 2040 is a massively complex, in a mathematical sense, system. I don't think it can be solved from the center. I don't think it can be centrally planned. I think it can only optimize itself and remain stable if you allow those heavily distributed sources of flexibility, demand and generation flexibility, to co-optimize with each other in real time through price. I think that's the only way we've really worked out how to solve massively complex systems so far. So I think storage and batteries, my vision there is that rather like on the Millennium Bridge, the Arab engineers had to come in and put in the stabilizers all the way along the different struts of the bridge. I think we will end up with a system of massively distributed BESS at almost every GSP, because I think the constraint management on the grid in 2040 will be a massively complex constraint problem between GSPs. We're not going to think of B6 anymore. The problem will be heavily localized, real-time, constantly changing, and therefore the digital capability of BESS will be able to solve those problems on a more distributed basis. I think on the second issue around duration, there's no doubt that the difference between 2030 and 2040 is we will need to really push storage into that 10-hour plus 20-hour duration. And I'm nervous that we shouldn't try and pick the technology that will most cost effectively do that. The rate of change in the BESS technology and cost curve is extraordinary. And I say that, having had experience of investing across semiconductor and consumer electronic sectors for almost 30 years. So I think we should allow the technology to show us what the most cost-effective solution for 10 to 20-hour storage is. I honestly think, as an agnostic investor, I honestly think it will be very, very difficult to choose anything other than battery technologies in the most general terms to provide that 10 to 20-hour storage in 15 years' time. It's very clear that lithium is pushing right past 6 into 8 hours now as the most economic form of storage. I have faith that that cost curve will relentlessly carry on. And so I think I would compete against gas every day of the week with whatever technology is best available now in 2030 or in 2040. And when I look at those graphs from NESO, my view is we should be pushing all of that gas volume off the system, and we will be able to do it cost competitively at 10-hour, 20-hour durations by 2040.
Paul, you're nodding your head. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, absolutely. I think we've identified the need. We can see we've got this challenge coming in that medium and longer duration storage around that 8 to 20 hours that you talk about. And absolutely, we need the market to drive out what is going to be the most cost-effective solution for providing that. So really interested to see how that continued development in batteries helps to do that.
And from a French perspective, and you're thinking about batteries being able to play in long duration, how has that been rolled out or thought out so far?
In French perspective, just to give you an overview, in France, RT invests into several batteries during a demonstration, because as a TSO, we're not able to own the batteries. So we started a small demonstration with 4 batteries into our country in order to solve network congestion issue. But the regulation authorized us to invest into battery. And just last week, RT published the 10-year network development plan. We need to invest into our network less than 100 billion, 94 billion euros in the next 15 years. It's a huge investment. In order for climate change issues, in order to connect all our future industry, and last one, to replace our network, because we built our network 50 years ago, I think 60 years ago, after the Second World War, and during the investment on nuclear power plant by EDF. So, yeah, we need to accelerate. And I'm sure that we can find a place for batteries if you change regulation. And maybe it's a regulation, it's the market, I don't know. But we need to work on that. The investment, we will increase our investment by 4 or 5 in the next 5 years. It's a huge thing. But I'm sure that we can find batteries can play a role in the transition, for the transition. Because at the end, we need to invest into our network. But for the transition, battery can be the grid enhancing technologies, the best one for the network.
Andy, you're nodding your head. Have you got a response to that?
It's a really interesting point, Phoebe. I think it's interesting hearing from a kind of more TO perspective on the potential role of batteries within their network. And in Germany, there's the example of grid boosters, which are controlled by some kind of local TOs as well. And from a a systems perspective, you can kind of see from a TO perspective why they'd want to control these batteries and how it kind of adds that redundancy and stability to the network. So from a systems perspective, it's very logical, but I think from a developer and kind of investor perspective, what we can see, here today and yesterday is there's a huge pipeline of projects across the whole of Europe from private developers and investors ready to go. We've already built a lot in the UK. So we've got that capability and that kind of innovation and entrepreneurialism to get these projects built and going quickly. So I think that systems question shouldn't be, should the TOs operate those assets and build and own those assets? It should be, how do we interface these projects coming to market with existing control rooms, with the interface to really get the best out of them? So I agree with a lot of Florent's points, but I'd caution away from us kind of having TOs kind of really taking a stake and owning these projects at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think really interesting perspective from both sides in terms of the way that you're seeing the market and the needs within the grid is really interesting. I'm noting that there are some questions on the floor. First one from Jamie. Thank you, Jamie. There has been a lot of talk about locational nodal pricing. Is it realistic that this could change, could be implemented, and should developers be factoring this in? This did come up in our pre-conference chat. Jim, do you want to take a stab at this one?
That's a hospital pass. How can I contribute something positive to this massive debate? I think we in the storage industry and the green generation industry need to ask why NESO is going on about this so much. It's either LMP or it's Tenuos. They're not doing it for fun. There is a massive, massive economic problem in the green grid today, and it's the cost of constraint management. And this is not a pejorative thing. It is caused by intermittent renewable generation being a long way from demand. And that's just a fact, and we've known about this for at least 10 years. I think back to the modeling Imperial did. The behavior of the system today was entirely predictable and is actually conforming to what the models said it would be. So I understand the disruption it causes, I understand the regulatory uncertainty it causes, but fundamentally there is an economic problem here, which is not every green megawatt is worth the same. And I personally think some form of nodal pricing is needed to accurately reflect the economic value of a green megawatt at different times and at different places. But it's an absolute nightmare implementing it, and I can understand why it disrupts project finance models.
You can make the suggestion, you're not going to be the guy to do it, so it's fine, Andy, I'm going to jump to you. What's your take on this?
I agree with Jim on the whole. A lot of it's about kind of certainty and continuity. We're developing projects out in Texas, which is an LMP market, and there's pros and cons of it, but you know what you're getting. It's an energy-only market, so you can theoretically connect anywhere, but you might be curtailed, 90% of the time if you pick the wrong location. So it's on you as a developer and investor to pick the right location, to make sure your grid analysis is correct before developing your projects. I think in the UK, NESO and government, I'm impressed with the work they've done on connection reform and how they've sped that up. But we are running into a slight contradiction for UK batteries where on the one side, we're moving to a bit of a centrally planned system where we need this many gigawatts in these particular areas. But then within 6 months' time, we could also see REMA and locational pricing being kind of layered over the top of that. So back to Jim's point, it's a very difficult one to model from a financing perspective if you're developing batteries right now.
Paul, do you want to jump in?
Who's got the hospital pass now? So, I think we as NESO have spoken many times about the benefits that we see in bringing a locational pricing signal. We have a market that was today not designed for the system that we operate today, and certainly not designed for the energy system of the future. And in wanting all of the assets, the battery assets, the generation assets, the flexibility assets, right down to us as consumers, to behave in the way that's the best for the system, then we need to make sure the right signals are being passed to those. And I think there is a very strong case that you get some of that efficiency in the operational use of the system and reducing those constraint costs that we see today by having a locational signal in pricing. Now, you absolutely accept that you've got to go through the transition to get to that point. But at the moment, I think that the end point is beneficial for the energy system of the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do we need another market? I don't want to answer to this question because it's a challenging question as a TSO perspective. And I see the advantages of the zonal market. There are several ones, and I don't want to go further into details. But when we develop the zonal market, we specify that we have a copper plate into our network, and the interconnection will make the link to have different prices. And we develop a lot of interconnection between the different European countries. But that's a good question. We need to give incentives. And what we propose on RT side is to facilitate the connection in some location for batteries, data centers, or other one. As you know, 2 weeks ago there was the Congress on AI. So we pushed several things during this conference. But last week we mentioned that, this point. Yeah, in some area, we will facilitate the connection of battery storage capabilities in general, but with some constraint. You need to consume when we have a lot of generation of solar panel in order to solve the network congestion. But we will facilitate it. I don't know if we need another pricing, but TSO has to facilitate the connection in some place in order to solve the different issue and to facilitate the vision for markets.
Go for it.
Just briefly, I won't repeat what's already been said, but like from an Irish perspective, like we also recognise the value of that locational signal. I think you said it as well. The value of your green megawatts is going to be dependent on that location. So, what we're doing in next month in that consultation window is we're trying to get that feedback from the market to determine what's the best way to do it. We're also looking at creating a sandbox for technology as well who are not at the same TRL level to try and see to kind of promote and help those technologies get on the system quicker. But from an overall SO perspective, that kind of central coordinated approach has a lot of value and efficiency. And so if we can work in harmony with the kind of the market and the developer-led approach, I think there's a solution out there. We just need to figure it out.
Super interesting. We're doing a lot of work on this as well, so it's really fascinating to hear all of your perspectives. I'm going to just quickly run through some of these. I'm going to do a quick fire round, which is going to be fun. Academic work points towards very long duration storage needed to handle years of suppressed renewables output. Is there a disconnect between TOs and academia? Don't raise your hands too quickly.
Yeah, quickly. So I'm working a lot with academics, research centers as an R&D division, a part of our R&D division. Yeah, they propose different solutions. But for 2040, we need to be realistic and pragmatic. If we want to install something into our network, we need 5-10 years. And most of the academic for the moment speak about H2 storage. For the moment, it was almost 10 years that everybody speak about H2. We don't have electrolyzer into our network. Anyway, the first one just will come in 2025, 2026. And the risk that the industrial will take with H2 storage is too much important. They don't want to install. So, yeah, we need to work with academic. We need to collaborate with academic. But think about realistic solution and think about the time to market also at the end.
Brilliant. I'm going to do maybe a yes-no answer to this one. Or first, I'll go to Paul. Why is NESO not promoting 4+ hours of BESS out to 2035?
I'm afraid I don't quite understand what the question is asking me. We don't promote one particular technology over another. We promote the future needs of our system. So if the individual would like to come and have a chat with me at the end of the session, I'll be very happy to do so.
Fabulous. So one-on-one. And then finally, from Max, do we need a public exchange dedicated to flexibility as opposed to electricity? Maybe a yes or no answer there. Andy, go on.
I don't think so. In the capacity market, we are looking at reforms towards valuing flexibility and to really represent, that what it can provide to the system. But personally, I don't think we need another exchange to what we've already got, more dedicated to flexibility.
Brilliant. I'm going to leave it there. A big thank you to all of my panelists. It's been fascinating talking to you offline and here as well. And thank you all for being here. A big round of applause, please.